War is a horrible thing, yet some acts of war are more horrible than others. The sinking of the Australian hospital ship Centaur on May 14th, 1943 is well known in Australia, but, well, not so much here in the United States. In America, we rallied to Remember Pearl Harbor. In Australia, they rallied to Avenge the Nurses. Yet there was one U.S. Navy vessel whose story was indelibly tied to the loss of the Centaur, and the victims of the sinking of the Centaur deserve to be remembered. HMAS Sydney was a Leander-class light cruiser, ordered for the Royal Navy but purchased by the Australian Navy during construction. Launched in September 1934 and commissioned a year later, she helped to enforce sanctions during the 1935 Abyssinian crisis before sailing for Australia. At the outset of the Second World War, she served on convoy duty and then with distinction in the Mediterranean before returning again to Australia. On November 19th, 1941, she was off the coast of Western Australia when she encountered a merchant vessel acting suspiciously. The ship claimed to be a Dutch vessel, but when Sydney pulled alongside, she revealed herself. It was the German raider, Cormoran. Built as the merchant vessel Steiermark, the future Cormoran was launched in 1938, but never operated as the merchant vessel it was intended to be. Before she was finished with sea trials, war was declared, and the vessel was outfitted as an auxiliary cruiser. Well armed, the ship's weapons were hidden, allowing the ship to masquerade as a merchant vessel and approach enemy ships. She had a successful raiding career, sinking 11 Allied merchant vessels in 9 months and diverting significant Allied resources before encountering HMAS Sydney. An auxiliary cruiser, Cormoran was well armed, striking Sydney with 4 of her 5.7-inch guns, destroying the bridge and fire control system. Sydney's initial salvo was not as effective as Cormoran's, but further fire damaged the raider. Then Sydney was struck by a torpedo. Cormoran's engines were disabled by fires, but Sydney was critically damaged. She sank, with the loss of all of her crew. But Cormoran proved to be beyond repair. The crew retreated to lifeboats and scuttled the ship. Holly Pritchard writes on the website of the Australian War Memorial, the loss of Sydney, with 645 crew, shocked the country. However, its final act was to critically damage Cormoran, which also sank, restoring some semblance of equilibrium. The Australian Navy did not become aware of the engagement until survivors of the Cormoran were found by a British tanker. Several ships and planes were sent to search for the missing Sydney. Among those was a merchant vessel, the Centaur. Launched in June of 1924, Centaur was built for a British shipping company with the intent of operating between Western Australia and Singapore. 315 feet long and 3,222 gross registered tons, she was built to carry both cattle and passengers as cargo. Centaur had been bound for Fremantle from Singapore when the Royal Australian Navy ordered vessels in the area to search for survivors from the battle between Sydney and Cormoran. Several life rafts of various sizes from Cormoran were being found, and survivors were taken to the Western Australian town of Carnarvon. Centaur was ordered to pick up those collected and transport them to Fremantle for questioning. The Australian War Memorial webpage writes that the Centaur was ordered to Carnarvon to take on board the Cormoran survivors when on the evening of 26 November 1941, she came across Captain Detmer's heavily laden lifeboat. Captain Dark of the Centaur, fearing the German sailors could overpower his small crew, only permitted 9 wounded or sick German sailors and 1 Chinese sailor, a prisoner of the Germans, to come on board. Pritchard describes the arrangement as a less than hospitable tow. When the overloaded German lifeboats were swamped, Dark lowered 2 of his own lifeboats, and the War Memorial website writes, the now very wet German sailors remained in the Centaur's lifeboats, and the tow continued. Thus, Centaur played a role in what was, at the time, probably the most famous sinking experience by the Royal Australian Navy. But it would not be her last role in such an affair. While the outbreak of war with Japan forced Centaur to change her route, she continued operating off Western Australia through 1942. But the ship was about to take on a new role. The Australian Navy made a request for Centaur from the British Ministry of Shipping, which transferred Centaur to the RAN on January 4, 1943. The Australian War Memorial writes, following Japan's entry into the war and the subsequent bloody fighting in Papua during 1942, Centaur was converted into a hospital ship with the aim of ferrying patients between Port Moresby and Townsville. Her conversion began in January 1943 and was completed 2 months later. The Launceston, Tasmania Saturday Evening Express reported, to rip out the inside and refit, 150 men worked 68 hours a week. Before the war, the ship would have to have been sent overseas for this work to be done. The Melbourne Age reported that the conversion involved all the hospital berth construction and every phase of the shipwright's calling. The whole of the conversion and equipment work was carried out within one port, and the job, it was stated, represented a new record for expeditious completion. Her complete metamorphosis from cattle ship to the latest type of hospital ship was completed in just under 8 weeks. The Centaur had been chosen for her size and relatively shallow 20-foot draft. The Sydney, New South Wales Sun reported that the smallness of Australia's latest hospital ship will allow it to steam where larger ships cannot go, especially in tropical islands. Despite the smaller size, she was a well-equipped ship, intended to carry casualties from the costly New Guinea campaign. The Perth West Australian reported, although considerably smaller than other Australian hospital ships, Centaur was completely equipped and specially designed for service in the tropics. Special attention has been given to ventilation and refrigeration. Frank Ford, the Minister of the Army and a future Prime Minister, told the paper that the Centaur would accommodate 250 patients and medical and nursing staff. It contained double-tiered cots, some of which were specifically designed to accommodate particular cases. All necessary facilities had been provided for the treatment of surgical and medical emergencies which might occur during a voyage. The Sun noted that a dentist room, X-ray equipment, operating theater, lifts, and a library were also provided, although chief difficulty is the lack of laundry, for which space could not be provided. The West Australian reported that patients could be loaded via watertight doors opening from the main deck, something that Ford said will make the evacuation of casualties from areas where Australians are fighting to the mainland even more speedy and efficient. But another modification was important. The Centaur would be operating as a hospital ship under the rules of the Hague Convention of 1907 and the Geneva Conventions of 1906 and 1929. Under these rules, hospital ships were not legitimate military targets and should not be attacked, so long as they were not carrying weapons or used for military purpose. Such ships had to be clearly marked, painted white with a green stripe, and fly the flag of the Red Cross. Japan had signed the Geneva Convention of 1929, but never ratified it. Still, PBS American Experience noted in 1942 Japan indicated it would follow the Geneva rules and would observe the Hague Convention of 1907, outlining the laws and customs of war. Pursuant to those rules, the Australian War Department of Veteran Affairs writes, running down the sides of the vessel were thick green stripes broken by 3 large red crosses. Painted on the bow was the number 47. This was the Centaur's registration number with the International Red Cross, and indicated that through diplomatic channels, the enemy had been notified of her status as a hospital ship. After fitting out and testing, the Centaur made its first run, delivering medical personnel to Port Moresby, New Guinea, and returning with wounded Australian and American troops to Sydney, arriving there on May 8th. She began her next run to Port Moresby on the 12th. The Australian War Memorial writes, on 12 May 1943, the Centaur sailed unescorted from Sydney at 9:45 hours, carrying her crew and normal staff, as well as stores and equipment of the 212th Field Ambulance, but no patients. 332 people were on board, including 149 of the field ambulance. The medical staff included 12 nurses. Carl James of the Australian War Memorial writes, Centaur kept her civilian crew, but her medical staff were all members of the Army. The men were from the Australian Army Medical Corps and the women from the Australian Army Nursing Service. Centaur only completed 2 voyages with patients before she began her ill-fated 3rd and final voyage. Pilot Officer Lawrence Wood was aboard the Liberty ship William A. Holbrook, leaving Brisbane on May 14, 1943, when he saw the Centaur. He recalled, there's a ship coming towards us, and it's got searchlights on the front and on the back of the ship, shutting down into the water. That's funny. Big red cross on the side. And it's a hospital ship. The Department of Veterans Affairs writes, nobody who saw it would have been in any doubt that the Centaur was a hospital ship. George McGarth was a 26-year-old ambulance driver with the 212. He told 60 Minutes Australia in 2003 that one of the nurses had a birthday that night. The nursing sisters decided to put on a party. They had a cake and all the fittings and whatever, and the captain supplied quite a lot of beer and so forth. The Department of Veterans Affairs website writes, however, that the Centaur was sailing into dangerous waters. In 1943, the oceans and seas off Australia were a battle zone. As it sailed upon the coast of New South Wales towards Queensland, the Centaur passed close to the last resting places of the Kalingo, the Lydia M. Childs, the Wollongbar, the Fingal, and the Limerick. These merchant ships had been sunk, some with great loss of life, by Japanese submarines between 18 January and 29 April. There could be no doubt of the intensity of enemy activity in the sea lanes by which the Centaur was making her way north. Despite her status as a hospital ship, the Sydney Morning Herald wrote last year, in the hours before dawn, the Ship of Mercy, fitted out to transport wounded soldiers from New Guinea to Australia, was stalked by a Japanese submarine. The Japanese submarine I-177 was a Keitel-type cruiser submarine. Commissioned in December 1942, she was 346 feet long and had a crew complement of 86. The boat had begun its first war patrol off the coast of Australia under the command of Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Nakagawa on April 10th. The I-177 had found limited success, sinking the British cargo ship Limerick on April 26th. By May 14th, the submarine was nearing the end of its patrol. James writes, shortly after 4 a.m. on 14 May, while most people were asleep, a torpedo struck Centaur's port side, hitting the oil fuel tank, which ignited in a massive explosion. The bridge superstructure collapsed, and the funnel crashed onto the deck. Everything was covered with burning oil, and a fire quickly began to roar across the ship. Water, meanwhile, rushed in through the gaping hole in her side. Many of those on board not killed in the explosion or fire were trapped as the ship started to go down bow first, and then broke in two. In just 3 minutes, Centaur was gone. Seaman Matthew Morris recalled in the chaos, I finished the 12 to 4 watch and called the 4 to 8 watch to go down, including my mate. And I was just having a cup of tea, and this big explosion, and the ship gave a shudder, and the skylight fell in on us. And I don't really know how I got out of the mess room. And I'd say there was a dozen steps up to the deck, and I really can't remember going up them. But then I was washed off the back of the ship, and then I realized I was in the water. McGrath remembered I was sitting and I was looking at my watch. It's probably one of the last things you usually do before you sort of lie down, and I can't recollect whether I lied down or not, but I know that there was a dreadful explosion, and I must have been going through the bloody air for quite a distance. I picked myself up, and I always recollect, I don't know whether it's mental telepathy, a voice. I reckon it's my wife saying, Mac, get off the ship. Go, go, go. Get out, go. That's when I took off, hit the water, and I'm swimming. Luckily, I'm a pretty powerful swimmer. I was going for my life. I look back, and there's no Centaur. McGrath's watch had stopped as he hit the water. 4:10 a.m. It's now part of the AWM collection. Nurse Sister Ellen Savage was in her bunk. She recalled, Merle Morton and myself were awakened by two terrific explosions and practically thrown out of bed. I registered mentally that it was a torpedo explosion. In that instant, the ship was in flames. We ran into Colonel Manson, our commanding officer, in full dress, even to his cap, and Mae West life jacket, who kindly said, That's right, girlies, jump for it now. The first words I spoke was to say, Will I have time to go back for my greatcoat? As we were only in our pajamas. He said no, and with that climbed the deck and jumped in. I followed. The ship was commencing to go down. Savage was the only nurse to survive. In the sinking, she had been pulled under by the suction of the ship sinking. She had broken her ribs, her nose, her palate, and her eardrums were perforated. By morning, many of the survivors had found their way to a larger raft, remnants of the wheelhouse. Second Officer Richard Rippon was the senior officer who survived, but many were still in the water. McGrath recalled, when daylight came, and of course there was the great dorsal fin, round and round, round and round. They had been taking the screams, I do remember, recollect screams and cries for help. It was bloody pitiful. You couldn't do a thing. See, even on a float, you're at the mercy of the sea and their legs being in the water. The bloody sharks, you were a sitting duck. They grabbed them and pulled them under, torn to pieces in no time. What a bloody death. What a death. The sinking had come quickly. There had been no mayday. The Australian military didn't know that the ship had been sunk. Survivors were in the water 35 hours. Morris recalls a young soldier from the field ambulance dying of his burns. And I said to Sister Savage, who was practically opposite me, I said, I think this young chap's dead. And she said, Are you sure? And I said, Well, I'm pretty sure. And she felt over and she said, He's passed on. So I took his identification disc off him, and his name was John Walder, New South Wales Army man. I gave his identification disc to Sister Savage, and she said, Will you answer the rosary? And I said, Yes, I'll do my best. And she said the rosary, and I answered it. And we buried him at sea. USS Mugford was a Begley-class destroyer. The class were limited to 1,500 tons displacement by the Washington Naval Treaty and notable for their unusually powerful torpedo armament, mounting 16 20-inch torpedo tubes. Laid down in October of 1935 and commissioned in August of 1937, Mugford, and in fact all 8 of the Begley-class destroyers, was present for the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The flagship of Destroyer Division 8, Mugford was preparing to get underway when the attack started, and so was one of the ships most prepared for battle. The crew downed 3 Japanese aircraft, and was one of the few U.S. vessels to make it out of the harbor. Mugford served off of Guadalcanal and in multiple operations in the theater, patrolling from northern Australia. On the morning of May 15th, Mugford had departed Brisbane, escorting the British steamer Sussex. Gunner's mate Talmadge Johnson had been there at Pearl Harbor and claimed credit for one of the Japanese planes the destroyer had downed. He had been there when the Mugford had been attacked by air at Guadalcanal, killing 18 and wounding another 17 of her crew. The morning of May 15th, he was atop the number 3 turret on lookout for the enemy. He wrote in his diary, One day out of Brisbane, we picked up survivors of the hospital ship Centaur, about 57 men and 1 woman, at from 1 to 4 in the afternoon. Diane Rutherford of the Australian War Memorial writes, the survivors received medical treatment and were clothed, fed, and put to bed. The Mugford's crew also donated clothing, cigarettes, soap, and other essentials, as well as about 239 pounds for the survivors' immediate needs. A monument to the men of the Mugford reads, to effect the rescue, Mugford was at considerable risk of attack by enemy submarines. Members of the crew showed great bravery in entering the shark-infested waters to aid survivors. Mugford reported picking up survivors. The Department of Veteran Affairs writes, it was the first Australia knew of the nation's worst loss from submarine attack during the war. James writes, the loss of the Centaur deeply shocked Australia, and for many Australians she became a symbol of the determination to win the war. The attack on a clearly marked and illuminated hospital ship was taken as further proof that Australia was fighting against a brutal enemy. Marking the 80th year since the sinking in 2024, the Australian War Memorial writes, the phrase, Avenge the Nurses, became a rallying cry throughout the remainder of the Second World War. Just 64 survivors of the 332 on board were rescued alive from the sinking of the Centaur. The Australian government lodged a protest to the government of Japan over the violation of international laws of war, but the government of Japan denied involvement at the time. After the war, Australian war crime investigators suspected that the I-177, which itself did not survive the war, was responsible, but they couldn't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Proof didn't come until some war records were released in 1979. John Foley, a military historian, told Australia 60 Minutes, Nakagawa, the captain of the vessel, was nearing the end of his stint down here and he hadn't had any success at all. He didn't want to go home with all his torpedoes on board. Richardson calls the coincidence that Centaur rescued survivors of the Cormoran before the Mugford rescued survivors of the Centaur strange serendipity. I merely think war is a horrible thing. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.